I genuinely believe that in a democracy, that the government should look like the people that it governs. It should have lived experience like the people that it governs. It should have a basic understanding of the humanity of the people that it governs.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Eva Posner, who you heard up top. She's a political strategist and campaign consultant based in Richmond, Virginia, who works particularly with progressive, working-class candidates and organizations. We had a good conversation about what it takes to be politically effective with limited resources in often challenging territory. That's coming up. And in our arts and culture segment later, we'll look at a museum show in Jacksonville, Florida that pays tribute to another exhibition 100 years ago, which was credited with introducing the South to modern art. But first, it's time for our news roundup. This week, a lot of the talk across the region and across the country has been about SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, better known as food stamps, which provides funds for groceries to 42 million low-income Americans. About a third of them, 14 million, are in the South. Residents of the 12 southern states receive about $2.5 billion a month in SNAP benefits. Those benefits are paid by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they are threatened by the ongoing federal government shutdown. As of the day we're recording this, November 1st, the status of those benefits is a little hard to determine. The Trump administration had warned that funding for the program would lapse today and would not return until the shutdown ends. But yesterday, October 31st, two different federal judges ordered the administration to use available federal reserves to keep the program running while the shutdown continues. It remains unclear how or whether the administration will comply and how long it might take to get benefits allocated to people's accounts. In any case, it's a good time for a look at SNAP in the South, a region that has politically often scorned welfare programs, even as significant percentages of our residents rely on them. The first federal food stamp program originated in the later years of the Great Depression and ran from 1939 to 1943. The idea of providing regular food subsidies was resurrected in the 1960s. After a pilot program under President John F. Kennedy, Congress passed the Food Stamp Act in 1964, creating the framework for the national program that has run ever since. It's been through numerous reforms, expansions, and contractions in the intervening decades, but it's remained a pillar of the United States social safety net. About 12% of Americans currently receive SNAP benefits, which provide an average of $187 a month for approved food items. Eligibility is based on income and is capped at 130% of the poverty level. To be eligible, a single person living alone can make no more than about $1,700 a month, or about $20,000 a year. For a household of 4 people, the income cutoff is about $42,000 a year. The program costs the federal government about $8 billion a month. There are SNAP recipients in all 50 states, of course, but states with higher poverty rates have more. And as we've talked about before here, southern states have some of the highest poverty rates in the country. The most SNAP-dependent state in the South, and the second highest in the country, is Louisiana, where 18.4% of the population receives the benefits, according to federal data. That's nearly 1 out of 5 people. Alabama comes in at 14.6%, 1 in 7 people, and Mississippi at 13.1%. The southern states with the smallest per capita SNAP participation are Virginia at 9.4%, Tennessee at 9.8%, and Texas at 10.2%. In other words, there is no southern state where fewer than about 1 in 10 people receive food stamps. As of yesterday, 24 states had announced plans to provide food aid if SNAP benefits lapse. Some are creating their own direct payment systems to existing SNAP recipients, while others are directing aid and resources to food banks and other nonprofits. Those do not include most of the southern states. Only 2 have announced plans to actually cover lapsed benefits. Interestingly, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of participation in the program. Louisiana, which, as we said, has the highest SNAP rate in the region, stepped forward late last week to promise to cover the shortfall for at least the month of November for most participants. Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry, a conservative Republican, said the state would come up with $147 million to cover food benefits for about 800,000 SNAP recipients. Those include people who are elderly or disabled and families with children. He said another 53,000 recipients whom he characterized as able-bodied would not qualify for the state aid and would need to rely on food banks and other charities. Meanwhile, in Virginia, where the SNAP participation rate is about half of Louisiana's, another Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, announced his state would also free up funds to cover food benefits at least through November. Everyone who received SNAP benefits last month would be eligible. Of course, both Youngkin and Landry went out of their way to blame the budget standoff entirely on Senate Democrats, who are seeking to restore funding for health insurance for lower-income Americans. Here's a clip from Youngkin's press conference last week about the Virginia initiative.
I want to reiterate, this is not easy. We are creating a parallel food assistance program or system that, in fact, is going to step in where the federal government is not able to because the Democrats are keeping it shut.
But even the chance to bash Democrats hasn't been enough to sway other conservative Southern lawmakers. In Tennessee, Governor Bill Lee has ignored requests from Democrats and even some Republicans in the legislature to tap the state's $2.2 billion rainy day fund to provide food aid to its 711,000 SNAP recipients. A few other southern states are directing more state money to food banks, $10 million in North Carolina, $500,000 in Arkansas. Those are less, a lot less, than those states residents typically receive in SNAP funds, which are about $40 million a month for Arkansas and $240 million a month for North Carolina. The South's two largest states, Texas and Florida, typically receive about $1.1 billion a month combined in SNAP benefits. Neither has announced any large-scale efforts to make up the difference if benefits are cut off or delayed. Of course, SNAP's impact goes beyond its immediate beneficiaries. All of that money is spent at grocery stores and farmers markets, which in turn use it to pay food producers. Small grocery stores in lower-income communities would be likely to take a particular hit since SNAP payments constitute a significant part of their business. Even if and when the budget crisis is resolved and the government reopens, the threat to SNAP is a good time to remember that the program has already seen new restrictions this year as part of the Trump administration's big budget bill. A study by the Urban Institute says that young adults aged 18 to 24 could be especially affected by new work reporting requirements, not because they don't work, but because of the general chaos that often surrounds their lives. The study estimates that 700,000 young people a month, many of them working full or part-time, will likely lose SNAP benefits as a result. And they're not the only generation affected by the work requirements. The minimum of 80 hours a month has been extended to include every able-bodied person from 18 to 64. The requirement previously ended at 54. However it plays out, the possibility of losing SNAP is a reminder of how important our limited safety nets are, in the South in particular, how many people they protect from some of the worst harms of poverty and our ever-widening economic inequalities, and how vulnerable they are to the politics of the moment. Okay, now we're to my interview with Eva Posner. She is the founder and CEO of Evinco Strategies, based in Richmond, Virginia. She created the company in 2016 to focus on electing candidates who increase representation in government, specializing in first-time candidates from diverse backgrounds who face barriers in traditional campaigns, as well as issue campaigns that tackle systemic injustice. She grew up in Virginia and attended the University of Tennessee, right here in my hometown of Knoxville, graduating with a degree in communications, journalism, and electronic media. After college, she moved to California and gained political experience working on some local campaigns and serving as communications coordinator for the San Diego County Democratic Party. Then she moved back to Virginia, where she launched Evinco. Evinco is an unusual political consulting group because it is not focused only on helping with specific elections, but on building a deeper infrastructure to support progressive candidates and values. It runs programs to train not only candidates, but campaign staff and political operatives to be successful at grassroots levels. It also offers paid internships and fellowships to young people interested in political work, with the goal of building a pipeline of future progressive candidates and staff. All of this strikes me as work and expertise that is very much needed for progressive advocates everywhere, and especially in the South. I wanted to hear from her about the current climate for progressive candidates here and what it takes to break through. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, and I'm very happy that Eva Posner is joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, I'd like to hear a little bit about, in the intro, I kind of talked through your background, but, as you grew up and you lived in sort of different places around the South, what was the formation of your political awareness? What were the things that I guess you first noticed that made you pay attention? And at what point did it become clear to you that these were things that you wanted to work on and turn into a career?
Yeah. So primarily, I think it started with LGBTQ rights because I have a fair amount of LGBTQ family members. So my uncle, my sister, my stepsister, a bunch. And then my best friends growing up in Virginia, they came out when we were in high school, and their mother kicked them out of their house, and there was a lot of bullying and hate crimes and awful, and like parents turning their back on their kids and all these things. And I just couldn't for the life of me understand why these people that I loved so much were suffering for something that didn't hurt anybody, right? Like it was outside of their control. It didn't hurt anyone. And it was just fundamental to who they were. And I loved them so much. And, they're just being, otherized for it at different levels and different periods of their life. And I couldn't understand why that was happening. I think there was also, if I'm really honest, there was kind of an awakening when I moved to Knoxville, with how racist the South is, Knoxville specifically. So I guess when I was really young in Louisiana, I was just too young to understand what was going on. There was probably a fair amount of segregation, but I was just too young to really see it. When I got to Virginia, we lived in a military town. And so there wasn't a lot, even though it was very rural, there wasn't a lot of overt racism, primarily because as long as you were there to serve the flag, everything was about the Navy base, then you were cool. And so for a rural area, we had a fair amount of diversity. We had, Muslims, and we had immigrants, and we had people from, other countries and backgrounds that a lot of rural areas don't get exposure to. And I just came up with that as my norm. And then I got to Knoxville old enough to understand it and to watch everybody just self-segregate and divide. And I saw some pretty, awful things. And, I was floored when there was the KKK parade downtown and all the others. And I was just like, what the hell is going on here? And, something I don't admit very often publicly, but I had been a Republican up until my freshman year of college. And that was, I voted for John McCain. And I was convinced by my parents that we were at war and the veteran knew what he was doing and all the things and whatever. And to an extent, there was some representation piece to it too, because, as a woman who's interested in politics, seeing Sarah Palin initially, until she talked too much, was really exciting. And then when Barack Obama won, I was relieved. I was so relieved, and I realized that probably meant that I didn't believe in my vote, and that I needed to take a hard look at my, the way I identified myself politically, and I re-registered as a Democrat the next day.
Interesting. So then after college, obviously you had some experience working in politics, working on some local campaigns and with a local Democratic Party, and then you took this step of creating your own thing. And I guess what led you to that at a relatively early point in your career to decide, no, I don't want to kind of work up within these existing structures. I kind of want to go do my own thing. What were the needs you saw that you thought you could address most easily by doing that?
That's a great question. So there was a couple of factors. The first really being that I am not somebody who likes to do what they're told. It's just a personality thing for me. And I got really tired of working for people that I didn't believe in because my boss said so. And I love my boss, no shade on her. She was great. But, she was making her business decisions as she needed to make them. And they didn't necessarily reflect what I wanted to be doing. And so, there was that element. There was also the element of, I was in fundraising at the time, and we had a lot of clients who were first-time candidates and they didn't know what they were doing, and there's not a lot of guidance given by like the traditional infrastructure to first-time candidates. There's a lot of recruitment, and then they push you off a cliff by yourself. You know, they might train you on some basics. They might you might understand the concept of a pitch or a win number. But for the most part, you know, they're just going to kind of throw you off the cliff by yourself. And the consultants that we were working with were not helping close that gap for my clients. And I found myself, you know, sitting in the call time room with them, explaining the strategies that they were looking through, explaining what their budget said, explaining, you know, what this means and why we shouldn't worry about it right now or whatever. And there were just a couple of opportunities with a couple of clients where they either parted ways with or like inserted me into the consulting situation. And so I just I did that work on top of my full-time job for the first cycle. And then I decided that, you know, I might not know as much of these like old guard people do, but I work hard and I'm really smart and I trust my ability to learn, and my ability to like annoy people to death if I need to figure something out. And so, I just kind of took the leap, and it was early in my career. And there are still people who are a little bit pissed because I didn't wait in line.
So, and you've been doing this now for 8 years. So what does that work look like? What's the range of things that you've done, and what do you count as your wins and accomplishments to this point?
Yeah, so Evinco is 9 years old. We turn 10 next year, and then I've been doing it for an additional 2 years on top of that. So it's really all I've done for about almost a dozen years now. Mm-hmm. I really love, there's some elections that are close to my heart, some wins that we got that we weren't supposed to get. Those are my favorite, when you have an uphill battle and you surprise everyone. Those are great. We also have done some ballot measures work. In 2020, we were able to get an independent police commission for the city of San Diego that actually had subpoena power. And the ability to do like genuinely independent investigations. And that was really exciting. Their community had been trying to get that for like 30 years and had been, you know, thwarted at every turn by the police unions. And we were able to help them, you know, really channel all the hard work they did into the right spaces to build the infrastructure necessary to make that happen. We've also built just a lot of infrastructure, and that doesn't sound like maybe a win for some people. It's much less straightforward, but there are a lot of communities in this country, whether they are geographic communities or demographic communities, that don't have the political infrastructure that is necessary to really wield influence within the system. And I'm not talking about like your civics books and what you're taught in school. I'm talking about how it really works. And there are a lot of people who don't have the infrastructure necessary, which a lot of times means money. And we've been able to go in and help folks raise money from places that they wouldn't be able to, you know, pull a quantity of small dollar donors that ends up amassing to a large amount of money so that people have to listen, making sure they show up in the right space, and, you know, they have a really solid like grassroots lobbying strategy and things like that. Email lists and donor lists, and even just like Act Blue pages. I had a county party that I worked with last year in Georgia that just didn't even have a donate page. And so I went and forced them to make one. I was like, I will make a donation if you make an Act Blue page. And now they have infrastructure to fundraise that they didn't have before. And so there's some just really basics of politicking that are not granted to people. You have to go build it. You have to really take that power. They're never going to give it to you. And so we have done a lot of infrastructure building over the years in a lot of issue areas and geographies, and I've been really proud of that.
And so some of that work that you do that I think is really interesting is not only focused on individual candidates. Obviously, you do that. But thinking about the broader infrastructure that surrounds people, not just when they run for office, but then if they win, who is going to be there to support them, building up, you know, campaign staffers or potential future, you know, office staffers and things like that. Can you talk about that work a little bit? How do you find those people and appeal to them? And then what are you teaching them?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different ways that we do that. Evinco has a paid internship program and a paid fellowship program, which I'm really proud of. By the way, if you do campaign work, you deserve to get paid. It's a real job. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And then we also have an online academy that we teach, it's mostly me, but I essentially just took my entire brain after about a decade of doing this, and I just emptied it out into 10 modules, and it's everything from like the base, how to fundraise, how to write a finance plan, how to write a call script, how to identify what doors you need to knock, how to design a mail piece, how to do a Google ad, how to manage your candidate and make sure that that they're doing what they need to do and staying on task, but also that you have boundaries with them so that they're not treating you like crap and, calling you at 2:00 in the morning. Don't be that person. Nobody likes that person. And so, it's really my entire knowledge base up until that point, which I guess I recorded that in 2021. And it's really, I like to think of it as campaigning 201. It's a little bit above, the regular, the free trainings that you're going to get from National Democratic Training Committee or whatever. It's really about trying to make sure that people who can't afford consultants like me still have access to the knowledge they need to run a well-oiled campaign that is professionally done, that is on message, and that actually hits the people it needs to hit and talks to the people it needs to talk to. It's not necessary in every race to have some big fancy consultant. And actually most races, it's not necessary. There's over 500,000 elected offices in the United States of America, and we only ever talk about 500 of them, which is part of the problem and how we end up where we are. But a lot of those folks, like I've said before, they don't have a lot of the traditional infrastructure, and so they have to build it themselves. And you end up surrounding yourself with, your best friends and your cousins and your high school gym coach or whatever. And that's fantastic, and they're all well-intentioned, and everybody's working really hard, but they are not necessarily doing things in the most efficient manner. They are spinning their wheels. It can be very frustrating. And, you're working 80-hour weeks on this campaign, and maybe, 15 hours a week actually matters. There's a lot of things that don't have to be done, things that people tell you need to do, because things that people tell you need to do because running for office is like drinking from a fire hydrant. And so everybody tells you that their thing is the most important thing, and most of them are wrong. And making sure essentially that people have the skill sets necessary to be able to run these campaigns in such a way that they can win while also having the rest of their lives. When you're running as a working class candidate, it's really already very difficult. A lot of the machine is built against you. And you need to be able to run something that also fits your job and your caretaking responsibilities and all of that. And all your volunteers and, your kitchen cabinet, the friends and family who are helping you, they need to be able to do the same thing. And so trying to make sure that people stay focused on what really matters and what moves the needle, but have the knowledge base to do it well. I just don't see there's any reason to gatekeep that information. There's more candidates than there are consultants, and I don't see people doing good work as competition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you just mentioned working with working class candidates. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of candidates in particular who you're most interested in trying to, support and elevate? Because I know, on your website, you talk about looking for representation, whether that's probably women candidates, people of color. I guess, why is that a particular angle of your work, and what about those? And I'm thinking particularly in places in the South, what about those kinds of races and those kinds of candidates, face particular obstacles?
Yeah. So for me, that work is really important because those people weren't in the room when the Constitution was written, right? People like me were not invited to the table until 100 years later or however long. And the further away you get from, the archetype that is George Washington, the less representation you have had. And I genuinely believe that in a democracy, that the government should look like the people that it governs. It should have lived experience like the people that it governs. It should have a basic understanding of the humanity of the people that it governs. If we lived in a system where people's biases didn't get codified into law, maybe it wouldn't matter so much, but you can't. And there's no one who can look at you with a straight face and say that it does not impact your economic opportunity or your civil rights to be a certain demographic or a certain type of person, because all of these things are codified. So that really, really matters to me. We have historically over half of our candidates have been women. That I'm really proud of that. We've had about a quarter of them be LGBTQ. We've had just over 40% of them be people of color. And I think it's a space where, if I'm really honest, the straightforward races don't appeal to me. There are, on occasion, the working class white guy who I can get behind, and that's fine. There are lots of ways to have representation, including economic, and I think that really matters. But for the most part, donors like to give to people who look like their grandson. And if you look like a rich guy's grandson, then you probably don't actually need me and all of my infrastructure. You can probably do this without me. And I have limited capacity. And so I try to put it behind, the people who really need the work. Most of the obstacles that I see are monetary. The fundraising is very difficult for, like I said, people who don't look like some guy's grandson. It's even more difficult if there's not historically infrastructure to build off of it. So, you don't have a lot of donor data to work with, or, your county party is not super active or whatever. There's also a lot of viability challenges, and the fact that viability in campaigning is defined by old straight white guys for old straight white guys. And so, the traditional definitions of viability are things that are harder for people of other demographics to hit. And then they get stuck in this chicken and egg situation where we want to support you, but we don't know if you're viable. Well, if you gave me money, then it would, then I would be more viable. Well, we can't give you money because we don't know if you're viable. And it's very just back and forth. It can be very frustrating. So figuring out ways to go outside of that cycle in order to gain, viability in measures that are less traditional. So things that community outreach and things I've had some really horizontal campaigns that are run primarily by community, and they kind of dark horse their way in there. Nobody knows that they're there. Nobody takes them seriously. But, on election day, they're able to pull it out because while their opponent was calling donors, they were talking to the voters in the district. Or while their opponent was, spending a billion years in the, party infrastructure to try to earn an endorsement and impress elected officials, they were out talking to voters and really connecting with people. And so trying to redefine what it means to be viable and also be able to run campaigns that are so efficient and well targeted that even if somebody doesn't see you coming, it's possible for you to win. And then not only that, but if you don't win, because 90% of first time candidates lose, making sure that you come out of it with a solid donor database, solid name ID, solid, relationships within the Democratic Party, the labor community, the, larger progressive movement, so that you can then, if you decide to stay involved, turn that into either another run, or you can support future candidates, or you can organize to keep them from putting a toxic waste dump in your backyard. Whatever it is that you want to do, that infrastructure helps you do it.
How do you, when you're working one-on-one with a candidate and you're thinking about issues, policy platforms, you're working with somebody who, it maybe is committed to sort of broadly progressive values, maybe running in an area where those haven't always been top of the agenda. How do you, because I think this is something that, we hear a lot of talk about how the Democratic Party broadly is struggling with this. How do you talk to people about framing their issues, framing their narratives, so that they don't just get, sort of written off as radical leftist, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think I am in the minority of the folks in the Democratic Party. I don't believe that there's a messaging problem. I believe that there's a messenger problem. Uh-huh. I believe that the problem is the fact that we run our campaigns from some smoke-filled room in K Street full of old dudes who've been running campaigns for 40 years, and they sit there in their cigar smoke room and they say, okay, we care about this. And then they come in 6 weeks before an election every 4 years, and they broadcast billions of dollars screaming at people about what they think they should care about instead of listening about what people actually care about. And so I run my campaigns kind of ignoring the Democratic Party. That is not to say we don't go for the endorsements. That is not to say that the Democratic Party is not an important part of the infrastructure that we try to take advantage of. That is to say that the Democratic Party does not tell my candidates what to do. And my candidates run from a place of the issues that they really care about and the issues that the community really needs. And we try to identify that Venn diagram between the things they're really passionate about and that's keeping them up at night and why they're running for office and the things the community really needs. And a lot of times, it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all message. You can't talk about healthcare access the same way in a community that you have to drive 3 hours to the hospital as you can in the same way with a community that has a state-of-the-art, university medical center like Knoxville. They're different issues. And so, and there are different ways of framing the issue. And so you have to really be willing to, flip the script on the messaging and really listen. And that's really what I try to do. I do not try to have anybody run away from their values. I want them to have, I have certain values. I vet my candidates very hard to make sure that I am electing people that, match up with my values 85% of the time. That said, progressive looks very different in California than it does in Tennessee or in Virginia. And you have to be willing, if you're going to do this professionally, if you're going to be involved at any kind of large scale, you have to be willing to live with that spectrum and understand that somebody doesn't have to agree with you 90% of the time to vote with you correctly. And so there is just a lot of trying to understand the human element of why my candidates are in it. What is it that's keeping you up at night? Why are you doing this to yourself? This is really hard. There are so many other ways to make a difference, and most of them make more money. What are you doing right now? Why are you doing it? And really getting to the heart of that, and then gathering data from the community about what really matters there, and then matching those things. And those may be, they may need to build a grocery store. They may need to build a playground. They may need to clean up blight in a certain community. And they're not sexy issues that Joe Biden's running on that you can make a giant commercial on, but they're the issues that people care about when they walk outside the front door. And they make communities feel seen, and they solve problems for people that actually impact their day-to-day. And that's why I do mostly local and state politics, is because you have a much higher ROI on the effort that you've put in to be able to make change for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to wrap up by asking you about our current moment that we're in, which obviously at the national level, at a lot of our state levels, certainly in the South, looks pretty dire from any kind of perspective of progressivism. At the same time, though, are there opportunities being created by all of this chaos? I guess, how are you kind of advising people, say you look to any elections in 2026, where are the openings here?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of opportunity. I am of the mindset, and now I'll be honest, it might be out of self-preservation for my mental health, but I am of the mindset that this is one of those things where the dying animal is in the corner, clawing out desperately, and that's why we're seeing all of this noise. Also, it's systemic, and it starts with the Confederacy. So you can't even, it's a whole thing, and it's impossible to address in one space. That said, I think the fact that this political moment that we're in really is the logical conclusion of the fact that we never finished Reconstruction. And that is, this is the attempt of the South will rise again. This is the attempt of the Confederacy to take over the entire thing. And that to me means it's that much more important to listen to and pay attention to the people who are doing this work in the South. Tennessee has been a fascist government for like a decade.
Yeah,
right?
I tell people that all the time. Like, we've been here for a while.
Yeah, no, you've been here for a while, and you've still made huge progress. The municipalities, and particularly the cities, are doing like really solid work. You have some of the most inspirational leaders in the country. I mean, the Tennessee 3 thing was wild. I've seen Representative Pearson speak like 6 times since then. He's absolutely incredible. And there's an opportunity for infrastructure building and an opportunity to like really take this seriously. It does require funding, right? And the hardest part about that is that national funders, like the big people who do the big money, don't pay attention to these states. They give up on them. And I am like, the South is not red, it's oppressed. And that's like a big part of my heart and my belief. And so having these people ignore us is infuriating, and also means that we have the opportunity to build something independent of them, of ourselves, something crowdfunded, something crowd governed, something that belongs only to Tennessee, for example, that then by the time that, you know, they come in, it doesn't really matter. Right? You get to do what you want to do with what you have. I think Georgia's a really great example of that. They have a solid infrastructure now that they did not have a decade ago. Not everywhere. It's not the same all over the state, but it is statewide pretty fantastic. And I think, you know, there's significant opportunity for places like Tennessee to do similar things. Marsha Blackburn didn't really win her race by the number of votes. The undervote, which means the people who did not vote, was larger than her margin of victory. So there is incredible opportunity if we can identify leaders who will listen to people. If we can identify ways to build infrastructure that is independent of, you know, of this system. If we can find ways to flip the script on how things are traditionally done, because it clearly isn't working, then there's an opportunity, I think, to build something really beautiful.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Eva Posner with Evinco Strategies, thanks so much. I will include a link to your website in the show notes. People can go there and see all the different services you offer, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
In 1924, a group of 4 affluent women in Jacksonville, Florida, decided to stage something that neither the city nor the South as a whole had ever seen: an exhibition of what was called modern art. The modern art movement had begun in Europe in the latter decades of the 1800s with the emergence of Impressionism and the assorted movements that followed it. A famous 1913 exhibition at the Armory in New York City called the International Exhibition of Modern Art had a galvanizing effect on American artists and art patrons. Jacksonville was far removed, both geographically and culturally, from such influences, but the Jacksonville Women's Club wanted to change that. The civic group, formed by women prominent in the society of Florida's largest city, wanted to raise Jacksonville's awareness and understanding of art. Led by a dynamo named Mary Dell Hoyt, they formed the Jacksonville Fine Arts Society, and in 1924 they decided to hold their own Southern Showcase, a large and ambitious art show called the Jacksonville Women's Club Exhibition. It was the first major modern art exhibition in the South. It included nearly 200 works by more than 80 modernists, people like George Alt, John Dos Passos, Thomas Hart Benton, Pablo Picasso, Diego Rivera, Catherine Schmidt, and more. Crucially, 1/3 of the artists included were women, unusual even for a modernist exhibition of the day, and driven partly by the fact that the women who organized the show were also artists themselves. The show drew sizable crowds, although mostly women, which limited their purchasing power. In fact, only one piece actually sold. But it had a lasting impact. The Jacksonville Fine Arts Society evolved into the city's first art museum, now known as Jacksonville Museum of Contemporary Art. MoCA is operated as a cultural institution by the University of North Florida. And this year, the museum is paying tribute to its own roots with an exhibition called The Armory South, the 1924 Jacksonville Women's Club Exhibition Rediscovered. It includes some of the pieces and artists represented in that original exhibition, along with the history of the show and the until recently mostly forgotten women's club that organized it. The exhibition opened in April and continues through November 23rd, so you still have a few weeks to catch it if you're in or near Jacksonville. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. You can also write me at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. We'll talk to you later.